Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh Perek Shmoina Asar. The laws of sanctifying the new month, chapter 18. The difficult part is behind us. We've spent the last week getting into the weeds, learning the details of the precise calculations that would determine whether it would be possible to sight the new moon on the night following the molad, following the conjunction. Today, the Rambam deals with what I would call troubleshooting. Issues that could crop up in those times when the moon was the only factor in determining the new month. See, today we have a fixed calendar. You open up your calendar at home, you know when the new month is. But because in the times of old, the sighting of the moon was integral to deciding the new month, there could be some issues that can come up. The most classic of them would be weather issues. What if the moon, according to math, could be sighted, but weather conditions wouldn't allow for that? You can have certain issues. Problems such as month after month, Rosh Chodesh being declared on the 31st day. Remember, today in our fixed calendar, some months are 29 days, some months are 30 days. But in the times of old, since the moon was the determining factor, as the Rambam taught us earlier in these laws, if the moon was sighted on the proper night, Rosh Chodesh would be declared on the 30th day. If the moon wasn't sighted, the new month would be declared the next day, the 31st day. But if weather conditions repeatedly wouldn't allow for the moon to be sighted, you can imagine what would happen if you made a 30-day month, and then a 30-day month, and then a 30-day month, and I'll soon demonstrate it inside when we get to it in the Rambam. This can cause major issues. The mola, the time of conjunction, will start backing up in terms of your months, and instead of it happening on the 29th day of the month, it's going to start happening on the 27th day of the month. So these conditions have to be taken into account. In a certain way, even in the times of old, they couldn't just follow the moon, because if you're relying on a physical person sighting the physical moon, there are things that can get in the way of that. And that's what the Rambam is going to be explaining today, as well as at the end, we'll get into some geographical issues with sighting the calendar, sighting the new moon, and how you could know whether or not the new moon could be sighted in Israel using other lands as a point of reference. So here we go without further ado. It says that Rambam halacha aleph davar yodua ubarur. It is clear and obvious that even if the math that we've done the last week yields the result that the moon will be sighted on the night following the molad, it's still efshar sheyera ve'efshar shelo yera. It's still only possible. Maybe the moon will be sighted, maybe not because of the moon's visibility, but because of other conditions. Either because the clouds will cover it, or because the place where the witnesses will be won't be optimal for sighting the new moon. Shehu gai, either it's in a valley, or people won't live in a valley, but they'll live in a place which is blocked by mountains in the west. Remember, the only place to see the new moon is in the west, right after sunset. Moonset approaches very quickly afterwards, and you have to look out to the west to see the moon. In which case, if your view is blocked, it's as if you're sitting in a valley. Because the moon will not be sighted by somebody who's in a low place, even if the moon is big. On the other hand, it will be seen to somebody who's standing on top of a high and steep mountain, even if the moon is very small. In order to sight the moon, you need to be in a good place, a good viewing point. The moon is easily sighted by somebody who is on the beach, on the edge of the sea, or somebody who's at sea on a ship, even though it's very small. In order to view the moon's crescent when it's very small, you have to be in a good spot, on the water, on top of a mountain. But if it's cloudy, or if you're in a valley, or if your view is blocked, even if the math tells you can see the new moon, you might not be able to see the new moon. Halacha beis v'chein b'maysak shamim. Same thing in the wintertime. If it's a clear day, the moon will be more visible, more clearly visible than it would be on a similar day in the summertime. Because a clear day in the winter means means very clear air, very clear air. The sky will be seen cleaner, more pure, because there is no dust mixing in the air. It's rainy time. The water causes everything to settle. But in the summertime, when it's more dry weather, many times the airspace around you, which is the airspace through which your visibility of the moon will go through, will appear smoky. mipnei ha'avak, because of the dust. This was especially common in those times when we didn't live in proper cities as we do today. But even today, many times things can get in the way of your visibility. V'yirah hayareach katan, and the moon will appear small and not so easily sighted. So, again, these are issues that can get in the way. The Rambam lets you know just for a moment a way to tell whether the moon in its short window of sighting will be bigger or smaller. So the Rambam reminds us of the way we began and concluded yesterday's chapter. Yesterday's chapter, the most loaded chapter of all the mathematical calculations, began with what we call the Oirech Rishon, the first longitude, in other words, the initial distance east to west between the sun and the moon. And after all the adjustments back and forth with adding and subtracting, we ended up with what was called Keshes Hari'iyah, the final arc of sighting, which represented the point of the moon at its current state, parallel to the horizon in Jerusalem. In other words, so you can know where you will see the moon as it sets on your horizon. And that's the Keshes Hari'iyah on the right, the Oirech Rishon on the left. At the end of yesterday's chapter, the Rambam said the way to tell whether the moon will be sighted is to compare those two. The distance, or the amount of degrees of the arc of sighting and the amount of degrees of initial distance between the sun and the moon will tell you whether the moon will be sighted if together they equal a combined number of 22 or more. And the Rambam tells you here, Halacha Gimel, v'chol zman shetimtza keshes hari'iyah, v'ha'oirech harishain shetarech la, im shnei hakitzim shalahem, b'tzimtzum. Anytime the arc of sighting, as compared to the initial longitude, with their limits. Remember the limits that Rambam gave us at the end of yesterday's chapter. Limits meaning the way to know whether you're going to sight the moon, if they equal 22 or they equal more than 22. If they come out to an exact number, in other words, you're just able to see the moon, that means that number one, the moon is going to be very small, the crescent is going to be very small, it's just getting far enough from the sun to be visible, and it also only be observed in a high place, because it will be closer to the horizon, lower down in the sky, and you'll have to be higher up to get a better view of that. If, on the other hand, the arc of sighting and the initial longitude are longer, there's more degrees of distance between the sun and the moon, and degrees were added more than their minimal amount of the limitations. In other words, it wasn't just a combined 22, it was more than a combined 22. In other words, there's a lot of degrees between the moon and the sun. The moon then will be seen in a bigger crescent because it will have more time to have distanced itself from the sun and get bigger. Again, according to the length of the arc of sighting and the initial longitude, that's what will determine the size and its revelation to all. In other words, the fact that everybody will be able to see it easily. Lefichach, says the Rambam Halacha Daled, taking all this into account, Roi lebeis din lasum shnei dvarim elu belibam. The High Court, who is calculating all this math, but also waiting for the witnesses to submit their testimony, they have to concentrate on these two concepts. Shehein, zman hari'iyah umekaima, the time of sighting and the place of sighting. They must ask the witnesses, where were you when you saw the moon? Because if the Bet Din, if the High Court knows by their own calculations that the arc of sighting is very short, and the calculation yields the result that the moon will only be seen minimally. For example, the Rambam gives the lowest possible number. The final arc of sighting was just 9 degrees and 5 minutes, whereas the initial longitude was 13 degrees, and that's the 13 degrees exactly, with no minutes. That will yield a very, very small crescent of the moon. Ubo edim shara'u, if witnesses then come and say, we saw the moon, the court has to ask them, where were you? If it was in the summertime, when the air is more smoky, harder to see smaller crescents, or they were in a low place, we have to worry. We have to suspect them. And check them a lot. Ask them lots of questions to ascertain whether or not they're telling the truth. But if it was in the rainy time or they were in a high place, even at the lowest possible combination of the arc and the initial longitude, it should yield a good visibility of the moon, so long as there's no clouds. Again, weather conditions permitting, you would see the moon very good. talking about clouds, the Rambam now begins to develop a very easily potential problem that can come up with regards to the calendar. It says the Rambam halacha hey, edim sharo hachodesh bizmanei. Let's say witnesses came, they saw the new moon in its proper time, ubo veheidu v'kiblum beistin. They came, they testified, the court accepted their testimony. They sanctified the new month, beautiful. The new month begins, Aleph, day 1 of the month. Then they counted 29 days from the day which was declared holy. The night of the 30th day, the moon wasn't sighted. Maybe it couldn't be seen. The mathematical calculations wouldn't allow for it. Maybe it was able to be seen, just clouds were covering it. Therefore, the court was waiting all day 30, but nobody showed up because the moon wasn't able to be sighted. So, no problem. This happens before, it happens all the time. The court will declare a full month. That will cause Rosh Chodesh Day to be on day 31, as we've explained. Now, as we develop this, let's show this on the calendar, on the pictures here. Let's just call it the month of Cheshvan. It's the month that we're in. Let's say Cheshvan began on a Sunday. Okay, Aleph is on a Sunday. Goes 29 days. That's Chavtes. Typically, the Molad happens every 29 and a half days. So the Molad should happen, the next day over here sometime. And let's say the court, there was nobody around. That day wasn't declared Rosh Chodesh. This day was declared Rosh Chodesh. Aleph. Okay. Now we're moving on to Kislev. So the Rambam says, this day was declared Rosh Chodesh. They began to count 29 days from the second month. And again, on the 30th night, the moon was not sighted. If you're going to say that just, no witnesses, okay, make the month full, make it day 30, and then you're going to make the beginning of the next month also on day 31. So here you have Aleph to Chavtes, 29 days. Day 30, the moon was not sighted. They declared Aleph only on the Thursday. That's Aleph Tevis over here, the next month. Well then, well, it's very possible that 30 days later, on the night of the 30th, they're not going to see the new moon over there. And they're going to keep on going and impregnating the months, making this month 30 as well. And now this month begins on the Shabbos. Now that's 29 days, and let's say on the next day you didn't sight the moon, so Aleph is on a Monday. And watch what happens. And you keep declaring new months after 30 days all year. You know what's going to happen? In the final months, it's possible that the Molad will begin to back up, and the moon will then, later on in the year, the 1 month where there is optimal conditions, the new moon will be sighted on the night of the 25th day of that current month, or 26th day. There's nothing more laughable and nothing more destructive than this. And you can see it over here on the screen. I've just used the blue as a daytime molad and the black as a nighttime molad. So let's just say every 29 and a half days is the molad. So here the molad will be in middle of this day. That's okay, still around day 29, day 30. But if you keep going, at this point, the molad is going to be on the 29th day at night. If you keep making 30-day months, now the molad backs up to the 29th day by day. You make another 30-day month, at this point already, after just 4 months, the molad has backed up to the 28th day. You keep on going, another 30-day month, 28th night. Another 30-day month, now it's the 28th by day. And you go another month, now it's already 27th by night. This is just 6 months on the calendar. If you go for a full year, as the Rambam says, it's going to back up, and you're going to have the molad being on the 24th day of the month, with the moon being sighted on the 25th day of the month. That's impossible. Rosh Chodesh, the new month, has to be when the moon is seen. The court must take this into account. And the Rambam just gives us, one caveat here. Don't tell me this is not common. That the moon won't be sighted all year. It's very common. It's very easy for it to happen. Remember, all it takes is once a month for there to be a cloudy condition. Or 1 month is a cloudy condition, 1 month nobody sees it, This could happen many times, or something like this. In a place whose winter season is very long, rainy season is very long, multiple clouds. Because we're not saying you don't see the moon actually all year round. We're just talking about a case where every beginning of the month, the moon is not going to be sighted. And then it will be seen later on in the month. Some months it won't be seen simply because it's impossible for the moon to be seen. And then the months where you could see the moon, it will be covered by clouds. It was too small, no person was able to actually see it. So this can cause big problems. If you only follow the sighting of the new moon, the sighting of the new moon can be disturbed month after month very easily. One time mathematically, one time weather, one time a person won't see it. And before you know it, you're making 30-day months one after another, which will really mess up the calendar. So the Rambam says, just for these cases, we have a special tradition. The tradition that was in the hands of the sages, one man from the other, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu was as follows. If month after month the phenomenon keeps repeating itself, and in the beginning of the month the moon isn't visible, the court will begin to impose a pattern, much like our calendar looks today, of one 30-day month and one 29-day month. And they will calculate and keep on setting the months, one full month, one lacking month. They will do it only in a way of setting, in other words, not the classic way of sanctifying. Remember, we saw in the beginning of these laws that typically when the witnesses saw the new month, the Beit Din would announce Mikudash, it's a sanctified month. But if the witnesses didn't come, and it was just automatically Rosh Chodesh on day 31, they wouldn't announce sanctified. It would just be set. So in this case too, these months that are being imposed simply out of weather considerations, even if they end up being 29-day months and Rosh Chodesh is on day 30, because the witnesses didn't see the new moon, the court wouldn't sanctify it. Because you can only sanctify the new moon when you see it. But the point is, the court takes matters into their own hands and makes the calendar accordingly. Sometimes the court will make 2 full months in a row, 2 lacking months in a row, as the calculations leads them to determine. The point is that at certain points, if the classic moon sighting version of the calendar isn't working, and not because of your own reasons, because of weather conditions or whatever, outside influences, then the court takes matters into their own hands and dictates the calendar, maneuvers it a little bit to match what we need in terms of the calendar being continued to be proper. The court should always have in mind, focus in their calculations, that if the moon will be visible the next month, it will be visible on the proper nights, the night of its proper time, going into the 30th day, or the next night, going into day 31. Never to be seen before its time, night of the 28th. Using the calculations of sighting the new moon, which we've explained in the last couple of chapters, it will become clear to you, and you can know which months it will be possible to be sighted and which months not. Again, we're talking about mathematically. Use that as a baseline. And then relying on that, you can start making full months after full months, lacking months after lacking months, always knowing in the coming month, based on the calculations, at least it will be possible to be sighted. And if the weather won't allow for it, we'll do another adjustment then. But the point is, you're always making sure that the next time, it's possible at least to see the moon properly. The basic rule to remember was, there can never be less than 4 30-day months, and there can never be more than 8 30-day months. The Rambam adds, when these months were declared full, based on the calculation, they would make the traditional meal of the full month, as we explained in chapter 3. We said in chapter 3 that even though the court didn't sanctify the new month because it wasn't seen in the proper time, but they would have a meal to celebrate it. This meal was done even in this situation when the court was actively declaring the new months, ahead of time. They knew what was coming. They were maneuvering the calendar, but they would still, because this month was declared full, you make a meal. Halacha Yud. V'choil shetimtza b'gemara midvarim shemarin shebeis din soimchin ala cheshbon. Anytime you will find in the Talmud mentions of things that will show that the court was actually relying on mathematical calculations, not on witnesses' sightings, and the fact that it's come tradition from Moses on Mount Sinai, and that the matter is given over to the court, and they have the permission to make lacking months or full months. Or you find in the Talmud the mention of the statement where one time there was somebody who made 9 lacking months in a year. Anything like it. All of these irregular statements in the Talmud, which appear to contradict the fact that the court was only embracing the moon sighting as the factor for determining the calendar, is all based on this principle. There was a time where the moon wasn't seen month after month, and it became impossible to just use the moon as the base of the calendar, and so some strange things began to take place. The court had to rely on the calculations, they had to make some years look different than others, and again, all based on this principle that the court had to know, when to use the mathematical calculations and the moon sighting, and when sometimes to use common sense and make the calendar as they saw fit. Halacha Yud Aleph. Similarly, the statement of the Talmud, the sages say sometimes when it's necessary, you can actively declare a full month, even if the moon was, could be sighted on the proper time. It's in these months. Where we declare full months based on mathematical calculations. We say one is full, one is lacking. And the court has the authority to make 1 month after another full, or to make 1 month after another lacking. It's in this case where the sages were talking about that we make full months out of necessity, because the moon isn't being sighted on time, and therefore they had to do all these adjustments. Only when the moon was seen in its proper time, the first time it's able to be seen after conjunction with the sun, that is when we always sanctify it. Other than that, we're not sanctifying, we're simply using our authority to make changes to the calendar so that we don't mess up the system for the future. Of course, this entire chapter, this whole discussion is only said at a time when the High Court was functioning and they were relying on the moon sighting. But nowadays, we only are relying on the fact that the calendar is fixed, based on the classic fixed mathematical calculations that are widespread among the Jewish people, as we have explained in these halachot, and therefore everything I've just said says that Rambam doesn't really apply nowadays. It only applied in the time when the court was fully functioning and only basing the calendar on the moon sighting. Now that Rambam introduces another concept, which is not really relevant directly and didn't influence the setting of the calendar, it's simply a trick, kind of like a way to remember whether the moon could be sighted in Israel. And the Rambam introduces it with the following fact. It is explained in the texts of astronomy and geometry that if the moon can be sighted in Israel, the moon will also be seen in all lands that are west to Israel and aligned with it. In other words, on the same line of longitude and latitude. See the map over here, okay? So we see Israel in the middle. This way is west. So if the moon could be sighted in Israel, it will also be sighted in Egypt, in Libya, etc. But if the calculations yield the result that the moon will not be visible in Israel, it's still possible for the moon to be sighted in the lands that are west of Israel. Why is that? A simple fact. We remember that the only window of sighting the moon is after sunset, after the sun has already set in the west, and the moon is still above the horizon. What makes the moon possible to be sighted is the fact that it's gotten further east from the sun. The more west you are from Israel, the more time you have till sunset, and the more time there is for the moon to get further away from the sun. So if in Israel, where sunset is happening, you're going to be able to see the moon, surely to the west, where sunset is going to happen later, the moon will surely be able to be sighted. But just because you know that it's not going to be sighted in Israel, maybe that's because sunset is too early. But in the western lands where sunset will be later, maybe over there, the moon will still be sighted. So in other words, a yes in Israel equals a yes in western lands. A no in Israel doesn't necessarily equal a no in western lands. Lefichach, therefore, says the Rambam, just because you see the moon in the western land, that is not a proof that the moon was sighted in Israel. If you would see it in Israel, that would be a proof that you're going to see it in the western lands. But if you see it in the western lands, doesn't mean it was visible in Israel. But if you cannot see it in the western lands, even on the top of the high mountains, then certainly it wasn't seen in Israel. Because everything's happening later in the west. If in the west, where sunset was later, the moon had more time, you couldn't see the moon, you surely cannot see the moon in Israel. So again, as it relates to Israel with the western lands, a yes in Israel is a for sure yes in the western lands. A yes in the western lands is not for sure a yes in Israel. A no in the western lands is for sure a no in Israel. With the east, it's the opposite. The relationship of the western lands to Israel is the same relationship of Israel to the eastern lands, because Israel is west of those eastern lands. So if you don't see the moon in Israel, you certainly won't see the moon in lands that are to the east of Israel, Jordan and Iraq, etc. Why? Because sunset happened earlier over there. The moon had less time to get away from the sun. So if in Israel, where there was more time, the moon didn't get away from the sun and wasn't visible, certainly it's not going to be visible in the eastern lands. But just because you saw the moon in Israel, it's still only possible. Maybe when the sunset was earlier, maybe it wasn't visible, maybe it was. So what's happening in Israel doesn't tell you about what's happening in the eastern lands, only if it's a no. A no in Israel is a no in the eastern lands. A yes in Israel doesn't tell you about the eastern lands. Lefichach, therefore, the opposite. If the moon was seen in the land that's east to Israel and exactly aligned with it, well then, it's for sure going to be seen in Israel. Because again, if where sunset happened earlier, the moon had less time, it was still visible. By the time it gets to Israel, sunset is later, the moon has more time to get away from the sun, it will certainly be sighted. But again, if it was not seen in the eastern lands, doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's a no here, because sunset is earlier, but by the time sunset comes in Israel, maybe the moon will be seen. Now, the Rambam adds one very important caveat. All of these rules about the relationship between western and eastern lands to Israel is only true if the eastern and western lands are exactly aligned. They're anywhere between 30 and 35 degrees north of the equator. But if they're more or less than 30 or 35 degrees to the equator, then they're going to have different laws. They aren't aligned with Israel. The second your horizon changes, you've seen that a couple times in the slides here, once your horizon changes, all the calculations change. So only in Israel and the same latitude will this sighting game work. But once you go more north or more south, the moon and the sun are setting at different times relative to your horizon. So you can't learn anything from that to what's happening in Israel. The Rambam concludes, all of these things that we just explained, as it relates to eastern and western lands, I've only included them to communicate to you all the rules that are relevant to setting the new moon. Simply to make the Torah great and beautiful. Not that the people in the eastern lands or the western lands were using their own moon sighting as proof of whether or not the moon was going to be sighted. And it didn't help them in any case of fixing the calendar. Only, and that's the only place that you can rely on for the new moon would be the sanctification of the high court in Israel, as we've explained already a number of times.